9 of the fantasy football season, and here's a few tight ends I would drop this week. The first guy, Robert Tanyan of the Green Bay Packers. For Tanyan, he was back on the fantasy radar after a good ball game in Week 7 was Tanyan versus the Washington football team. 4 catches, 63 yards and a touchdown. In Week 8 at Arizona, he got off to a good start. 3 catches, 49 yards. But now it's confirmed he's out for the season with a torn ACL. And Tanyan, I was big on him coming into the season, but this year it was a down year for him, no doubt about it, except the last 2 games in Week 7 and Week 8 where he got things going. But from Week 3 to Week 6, he did nothing. Week 3 at Frisco, 1.60 fantasy points. Week 4 versus the Steelers, 2.8 fantasy points. Week 5 at Cincinnati, 1.8 fantasy points. And Week 6 at Chicago, 3 fantasy points. So right now, obviously, there's no reason to hold on to him. Even in keeper and dynasty leagues, you're not going to keep a guy like Robert Tanyan, and hopefully he makes a full recovery quickly in the offseason, and he's ready for Week 1 next year. But right now, obviously, with him being out for the year, he's an easy tight end to drop this week. The second tight end is Ricky Seale Jones of the Washington football team. So I guess I was ahead of things here. Last week, I said to drop Seale Jones. It was his last week where he was going to be the starter for this Washington football team. Obviously, with Logan Thomas coming back in Week 10 after the bye. And Seale Jones, to be honest, he filled in pretty well, in my opinion, for Logan Thomas. Week 5 versus New Orleans, 9.10 fantasy points. Week 6 versus Kansas City, 15.80 fantasy points. Week 7 at Green Bay, 11.10 fantasy points. And this week versus Denver, it was just a train wreck at Denver, where he only had 3.20 fantasy points. And now they go into the bye. And Week 10, Washington comes back versus a good Tampa Bay defense, even though they didn't look good in Week 8 versus New Orleans. So right here, he's not going to be the starter. Thomas should be back, in my opinion. And teams, they've started to roll coverage as well to Seale Jones over the last few weeks. A starter or not, with the bye week coming up, he's an easy drop this week. And the third and final tight end, I would drop Mo Alley-Cox of the Indianapolis Colts. So Mo Alley-Cox, he's been a touchdown-dependent tight end this season, and now he had a goose egg in Week 8 versus the Tennessee Titans. He did have 4 targets, but he did nothing with them, obviously. But he was on a pretty decent run in PPR leagues. Week 4 Miami, 19.20 fantasy points. Week 5 at Baltimore, 8 fantasy points. And Week 6 versus Houston, 9.80 fantasy points. And Week 7 at San Francisco, 11.5 fantasy points. But in all those ball games, except at Baltimore, where he had 3 catches for 50 yards, he was touchdown dependent. So right now, I don't want to be dependent on only touchdowns from these tight ends. And this week, we saw a few guys break out and be better options than Mo Alley-Cox. So I think, in my opinion, I just can't take the risk with him, counting on him getting a touchdown every week, because obviously that's not going to happen. And we saw it in Week 8 where he had the goose egg. So that's a few tight ends I would drop here in Week 9 of the fantasy football season.